To God be the glory.
Hello, welcome back to our study. We're in the book of Numbers, and we've made it to chapter 11 is where we will begin in the lesson today. And in our outline, we are on the point of the sin of discontent, talking about the discontent of the people, and they start complaining to Moses concerning their circumstance. Look at Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. And so we see the complaining of the people, and of course the Lord heard it. The Lord hears everything. He knows everything that's going on. And so the people are complaining, and then there is a fire from the Lord that comes out and devours some of the people. And then Moses, of course, speaks up for the people, and then the others are spared. In verses 4 through 9, there's really no lesson that is learned. We see of more murmuring and complaining. It just continues to happen. Look at verse 4. Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Remember that manna was bread from heaven, given to them freely from God. And yet they were not satisfied. And they're thinking about how things were back in Egypt. Well, did they not remember how they complained while they were in Egypt? And they cried out to the Lord for deliverance, and he did deliver them. And now it's as if they're saying, oh, remember how good things were back then. You know how people think about the good old days, supposedly? Well, they weren't that good. They were in Egypt. They were in captivity, cruel taskmasters, doing very difficult work. And yet, here they were saying, oh, if we were back in Egypt. In verses 10 through 15, we see that Moses is saying, I've had enough of these people. In verse 11, Moses asks, why do you afflict me with all of these people? Why has this burden, in other words, come upon me that I've got to deal with these people and they're complaining? In verse 12, Moses asks, did I conceive all these people? He's saying, they're not my children. I didn't conceive them. And yet here he was burdened with their complaining. In verse 13, we see the statement, where am I to get meat to give all these people? And so they're not satisfied with the manna provided to them from God. They want meat to eat. Verse 14, it says, these people are just too much for me. If you're going to treat me this way, verse 15, then just please kill me. I just can't put up with them any longer, Moses is saying. I would rather not even be here than have to put up with these people and their complaining. Now look at verses 16 and 17. So the Lord said to Moses, gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. Then I will come down and talk with you there. I will take of the Spirit that is upon you, and will put the same upon them, and that they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. And so it seems that God agrees that this is just too much of a burden for Moses, and he needs helpers. He needs some additional support. And so here we learn of these 70 good men who are going to help to bear this load. And so in verses 18 through 20, we see there God says that he will give them meat for a month. As a matter of fact, he's going to give them so much meat until it actually comes out of their noses. There's going to be so much of it. Verse 21, Moses is asking, okay, well, how is this going to be provided? In verse 22, God says that has my arm been shortened. In other words, don't worry about it. I'm God. I have power. I'm going to take care of the people, and I can provide them meat. The arm representative of his power that he has. And so why should there be any doubt concerning his ability to provide for them? In verses 24 through 25, Jehovah shares his spirit with those who have been chosen to help Moses. Now, I want to just make a little note here. If you look at this, God never commands anything of anyone unless they have the ability to fulfill the command. No command that we've been given today requires special assistance from Jehovah or a miracle. He does not ask more of us than we are able to give. And so I think that's an important point. And maybe the people back then didn't understand that, but let's make sure we understand it today, that yes, we have the ability to do those things that God asks us to do. And so we need to live up to that commitment. In verses 26 through 30 in this chapter, two had not come with the others, but God's Spirit came to them in the camp. And Joshua feels that they should be stopped. But Moses, he wishes that all of Israel could benefit from God's Spirit in this way as they did. And so here's wishing that all would have that ability and the help that Moses truly needed. Now, in verses 31 through 35, you see a wind from God that brings quail to the people, so many so that it's 2 feet high of quail. They're still alive, and all these quail are there for them. In verse 33, while the meat was still in their teeth and they were still eating it, God would strike those murmurers and complainers dead. How dare you complain to God? Yeah, I'll give you meat. You'll have meat so much that you'll be sick of that meat. Now in our outline, we see the jealousy of Miriam next. And this is Numbers chapter 12 is where we see this begin. Notice what occurs. Chapter 12, verse 1. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. So they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Notice that phrase again, and the Lord heard it. God knows all things that goes on. In verse 1, the reason given is that Moses had married an Ethiopian woman. And in verse 2, you see the problem here is pride, really, with Miriam and Aaron. Does not God speak through us also? What about us? Look how great we are. We should also have this leadership role. In verse 3, God declares that Moses has more humility than any other man, and he is willing to be under God's control. You see, that's the difference. Moses was humble in that he was willing to submit to God and God's commands, and he would obey what God told him to do. Verses 4 through 8, Jehovah calls the three together and reminds them that Moses is the only one whom he speaks to face. In verses 9 through 13, God strikes Miriam with leprosy as a result of her jealousy and pride. And Aaron pleads to Moses for Miriam, and Moses intercedes for her. In verses 14 through 16, Miriam must spend 7 days outside the camp before she is restored and the leprosy is removed. Next in our outline, we go from Kadesh to Kadesh. In other words, here's the time of the wanderings. And this is chapter 13. It takes us all the way through chapter 20, verse 21. And in this section, chapters 13 and 14, we see the unbelief and defeat. In Numbers 13, 1 through 20, God has Moses send spies into the land of Canaan. Let me read that to you, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. And then it would further go on to list those men that were being sent into the land. Well, what were these men to do? Well, these spies were sent into the land to explore that region and to learn certain things. Notice this. Number one, they were to learn what the land was like. What kind of land is this? Number two, if the people are strong or are they weak, the inhabitants of the land? We need to assess that. Number three, if there are many or just a few, they need to understand that. Next, is the land good or is it bad? And if it was good, then that would kind of entice them and encourage them to take that land. Also, if the cities are like camps or are they like strongholds? How much fortification are we talking about in this land? Also, if the land is rich or poor, that would be something they would need to determine. And also if there are any forests. And so that would be helpful in their understanding of what needs to take place. So the spies go into the land, verses 21 through 27, and for 40 days, and then they return with the fruit of the land. Notice verse 25 of chapter 13. And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. And if you look down at verse 27, then they told him and said, We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. And so you see the wonderful report that they give concerning the land. Yes, they had been promised that it was going to be a prosperous land, wonderful land flowing with milk and honey, and they agree, yes, it is. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. And so they gave a wonderful report concerning the land and even brought back fruit from the land. But 10 of the spies say, it's just too much for us. We can't take it. The people are too strong. We're going to be defeated. And you know, in all of that, they are thinking about themselves and they are forgetting about God. That God is with them and God would help them to take the land. But they don't have enough faith in God. If you look down to verse 30 of this same chapter, chapter 13, verse 30, notice, Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Verse 32, And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. Verse 33, There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so were we in their sight. And so here's Caleb in verse 30. He's saying, well, we can do it. Yes, we've spied out the land, we've seen it, but his assessment is that it can be done. Well, why is he thinking that it can be done when the other spies say that it cannot be done? Because Caleb has faith in God. And Caleb realizes it's not them going alone by themselves. No, they have God on their side. But here the spies are saying, we can't do it. There are giants living there, and we are like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and even in their eyes, we're like grasshoppers. And so we don't stand a chance to take that land. How sad that this lack of faith was had by the people, and they did not trust in God. Notice chapter 14. So all the congregation lifted up their voice, and they cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? Isn't that sad? The people with such a lack of faith saying, we should have just died in Egypt. Why don't we just go back? It's time to turn around and go home. And they have no faith. In verses 6 through 9, we see that Joshua and Caleb, they tear their clothes. And that's a symbol of their great lamenting and sorrow for what is taking place. And they declare again that they can take the land. Joshua mentioned as well, Joshua and Caleb saying, yes, we can take the land with God's help. And then verse 10, the congregation responds to that. What do they want to do? They want to stone Joshua and Caleb. How dare you say this, that we can take that land? They didn't like hearing that because they probably felt guilt for their own weakness, their own lack of faith. And they said, well, we don't like hearing that. Let's put a stop to that, and so we should stone Joshua and Caleb. These are two of God's leaders among God's people, and the people wanted to kill them. Imagine that, standing up against leaders in such a way as this. And yet we should remember today that in the Lord's church, God has appointed leaders for the Lord's church. There are elders, there are deacons serving to lead over the congregation. Do we have the respect for the elders that we should? Do we show them the honor that we should? And when the elders say, oh, we can do this or we can do that, are we like the children of Israel and say, no, don't say that. We can't do it. Is it because of a lack of faith? Many times it is. Let us have that faith that we should in our God and truly submit and obey the leaders that we have. In verses 11 through 12, we see God would destroy the people and again offers to make a great nation of Moses. He says, I can wipe out these people and we can start over. I'll just create new people. But Moses is saying, well, if you kill them, then the nations are going to say that you're not able to provide us with Canaan. But let your power be great and continue in your mercy and your long suffering. And then the nations will understand that. And so Moses again intercedes and gives several great arguments for sparing the people in verses 13 through 19. Then starting in verse 20 through 38, we see that they are condemned to the wilderness wanderings. If they're not going to have the faith to take the land as they're supposed to, they don't have faith in God, then they're going to have to wander in the wilderness. In verse 24, God's servant Caleb, he will go into the promised land. Joshua and Caleb, those who gave that good report, they're going to make the promised land, but the others will not. In verse 29, we see that all 20 years old or older shall die and not go into the promised land. If you look at verses 30 and 32 of this chapter, it reads, except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun, you shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. So except for Caleb and Joshua, he's telling the people, you're not going in. Verse 31, but your little ones whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. And so here they had said, oh man, our little ones, they're going to be killed, they're going to be slain. And he says, I'll tell you what, I'll use them, and they will go into the promised land, and they will take it and possess it. In In verse 35, notice it says, I, the Lord, have spoken this. I will surely do so to all this evil congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall be consumed, and there they shall die. And I think that really shows the seriousness of their rebellion when he phrases it in that way, that they are gathered together against God. And in their complaining, their murmuring, their rebellion, they are rebelling against God. And they are going to be punished for it, just as any people would be when they rebel against God. So only Caleb and Joshua will be able to go in. And verse 34 tells us that the number of years wandering will equal the number of days that you spent spying out the land. So they spent 40 days spying out the land. Now for 40 years, they're going to wander in the wilderness. Verse 36 through 37, all the spies who brought a bad report, they're going to die. They're going to die of the plague. In verses 39 through 45, we see a futile invasion attempt without Jehovah on their side. Now it seems as if the people decide, well, okay, we're going to go in. And God's already said, no, you're not going to go in. You don't have faith. You can't take this land. But the people decide to do it on their own without Jehovah. And so they went alone. The ark did not go with them. Moses did not go with them. And they were not successful. You cannot do it without God. In chapter 15, we see laws and sanctions delivered to the people. In verses 1, there we see that we have various laws concerning sacrifice. In verse 29, we see the laws applied to the same to the Israelites and to those strangers who were there. In verse 30, it says, bring reproach or blasphemies. The one who intentionally blasphemies is to be put to death. The physical death, of course, represents in our minds that spiritual death today. In verses 32 through 36, you see the death penalty is instituted for Sabbath breaking. If you break the Sabbath, what's going to happen? Well, it's the death penalty for that. In chapter 15, in verse 33, it says there, and those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And then in verse 35 it says, then the Lord said to Moses, that man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. Well, you see, that seems like such a severe penalty. But understand, this is disobedience. This is rebellion. This is standing against God. And they need to understand that. We've already seen in these people that they are easily swayed by their complaining and their murmuring to go against what God would have them to do. And so any kind of disobedience or rebellion has to be put down. It cannot be allowed to continue and fester and grow and lead the whole congregation astray. In verses 37 through 41, it says to do this, to put tassels on the corners of your garments and to put blue thread in the tassels in the corners. We'll say, why? Why would they do that? Well, so that you will remember the commandments of the Lord and remember to do them, that you will not follow after harlotry. And because your eyes and your heart are inclined to do them, it says that you will remember to do my commandments and be holy for your God. They needed that constant reminder to obey. And you just have to wonder about us today. How much of a reminder do we need to make sure that we're always obeying what God would have us to do? Yes, we don't live under that old law, the keeping of the Sabbath, and the punishments of disobeying that Sabbath, but we do live under law, the law of Christ today. Will we obey? Will we submit and honor our God in that way? The children of Israel, they were weak so many times. In chapter 16, we see another example with the rebellion of Korah. Look at chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation. That's how big the group was, representatives of the congregation, men of renown. And they gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" Well, the point is they did not exalt themselves. God had lifted them up to be leaders. Moses and Aaron did not take this upon themselves. And yet here's Korah, Dathan, and Abiram trying to sow seeds of discontent and a rebellion here. Korah, we notice this, he's a Levite. He's a cousin of Moses. Dathan and Abiram, they're both Reubenites. And they gather 250 leaders. And so here's men that are known, men who have a following. And so they gather together these men and say, okay, let's go against Moses and Aaron. Let's get some power for ourselves. And that's what this is all about. It's all about the power that they desire. They're saying, well, all of Israel is holy, is their argument. Therefore, each one of us could lead. And so here they are trying to grasp for more control. You know, we have to understand how important it is that we submit to the leaders that God has provided for us. In verses 4 through 11, it says that you should be honored that you are Levites and that God has set you apart to serve him, is what Korah is told. Korah, why would you do this? You more than any other, Korah, you should know you're a Levite. You should realize. And so he tells them to bring your censers before the Lord tomorrow. And then the Lord's going to show who he wants to serve him. Now notice in verse 11, when you resist God's leaders, you're actually doing what? You're resisting God himself. Resisting the leaders is a resistance of God. In verses 12 through 14, they blame Moses for everything that's happened. They haven't been able to go into the promised land, and for their defeat when they went out on their own without God. And so they blame Moses for that. In verses 15 through 19, they all gather as instructed before the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord appears. Look at verses 20 and 21 concerning that. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." Wow, what a frightening thing. He says, separate yourselves from these evil men. And don't be a part of them. Depart, lest you be consumed in all their sins. He says, well, if they just die a natural death, then they're right. But if God opens up the ground and consumes them, that means that he has rejected them. And so what happens? Verses 31 through 35, God opens up the ground and he consumes them. Korah and all of those followers of his, the opening of the ground, the 250, they're destroyed by fire. In verses 36 through 40, the censers of these men, they're told to flatten them out as a covering on the altar, as a memorial, to teach and to instruct, to remind them that no one should ever try to usurp God's authority again. And so the sympathizers of Korah in the congregation, God would consume them also. And we see that in verse 41. On the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." You know, some people just won't learn. Here we've just seen this mighty demonstration of God's power and this punishment that takes place for their complaining and their murmuring, and they're still doing it. In verses 44 through 46, we see it continued, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." and they fell on their faces. And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a censer and put fire in it from the altar, put incense on it, and take it quickly to the congregation, and make atonement for them, for wrath has gone out from the Lord, and the plague has begun." And so Moses has Aaron make an atonement for the people, and Aaron takes his censer and goes between and stops the plague. Between the dead and the living of the congregation, the plague is stopped. But 14,700 die as a result of their continual murmuring and complaining. How sad. We'll have to stop there, but we will begin in chapter 17 next time. Thank you for your attention.